I was sitting in a ballroom filled with Manhattan's elite champagne glasses clinking when I saw him across the room. Garrett, the same man who had called me a loser 6 months ago at an alumni event. The same man who had humiliated me in front of a dozen people laughing at my unemployment like it was the punchline to his favorite joke. But tonight, I was not the man he remembered. Tonight, I held something he did not know about. Tonight, I controlled every paycheck in this room, including his. And he had no idea what was coming. Before I take you back to that humiliating night, I need to know something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe, because what happened next proved that silence can be the most powerful weapon you ever hold. Now, let me tell you how a single insult became the biggest mistake of someone's life. Let me take you back to where this all started. I am Chaim, 32 years old, and 6 months before that charity gala my life looked very different from the outside. To most people, I appeared to be drifting. No 9-to-5 job, no corporate title on LinkedIn, no impressive office to visit every morning. But appearances can be deceiving, and in my case they were hiding a truth worth $27 million. 3 months before the incident, I had sold my tech startup to a major corporation. The deal was significant, life-changing, the kind of exit that entrepreneurs dream about during those long nights of building something from nothing. But there was a catch. The acquisition came with a non-disclosure agreement that lasted 6 months. I could not talk about it, could not post about it, could not even hint at it on social media. As far as the world knew, I had simply vanished from the startup scene. The transition period was strange. I was no longer running the day-to-day operations, but I was still deeply involved as a major shareholder and strategic advisor. I spent my time learning investing in other startups and consulting for a private equity group that had connections to the acquiring company. I dressed casually, jeans and plain shirts, nothing flashy. I lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, the same one I had rented when I was bootstrapping my company. I was not interested in showing off. Money had never been about the display for me. It was about freedom and opportunity. That is when Garrett came back into my life. We had gone to business school together 7 years ago. Even back then, Garrett had a way of making everything about status. He measured success in corner offices and luxury watches. During our MBA program, he had looked down on me for choosing the startup path instead of taking a 6-figure offer from Goldman Sachs. We were never close, just acquaintances who occasionally crossed paths at alumni events. Garrett was now a senior director at Meridian Capital Partners, a large fintech company. He wore tailored suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His wrist always displayed a Rolex that caught the light at just the right angles. He had a permanent tan, the kind you get from frequent yacht weekends in the Hamptons. Everything about him screamed success, at least the kind of success that fits on an Instagram post. The fateful encounter happened at an MBA alumni networking mixer on a rooftop bar in Manhattan. The venue was upscale, overlooking the city lights, filled with former classmates who were now climbing various corporate ladders. My friend Kyle had convinced me to come. He thought it would be good for me to maintain connections, even though I could not yet talk about what I was really doing. I arrived wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt, nothing fancy. Kyle spotted me immediately and pulled me into a conversation with a few other alumni. We were discussing the changing landscape of venture capital when I heard a loud voice from across the terrace. "Chaim, is that really you?" I turned to see Garrett approaching with a group of his colleagues from Meridian Capital Partners. He had a drink in one hand and that familiar, overconfident smile on his face. "Garrett," I said, extending my hand. "Good to see you." The handshake was firm, competitive, the way Garrett always did things. His colleagues, 3 men and a woman all dressed in expensive business casual, formed a semicircle around us. "So, what are you up to these days?" Garrett asked, his tone casual, but his eyes already judging. I had rehearsed this answer many times. Taking some time to figure out my next move, doing some consulting. It was not a lie. It just was not the complete truth. But I watched as something shifted in Garrett's expression. The polite interest vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like satisfaction. He had found an opening. So, basically unemployed. His voice carried across the rooftop louder than necessary. A few conversations nearby paused. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. You could say I am between structured opportunities. Kyle shot me a worried glance. He knew the truth. He had been one of the few people I could confide in during the NDA period, but he could not say anything either. Garrett was not finished. In fact, he was just getting started. What happened next was not just an insult. It was a performance, and I was the unwilling star of his show. You know, Chaim here used to be so ambitious back in school. Garrett turned to his colleagues, his voice taking on that storytelling tone that people use when they are about to embarrass someone. What happened, man? I thought you were going to change the world with your little tech thing. His colleagues were paying attention now. One of them, a guy named Brad with slicked back hair, smirked. Another woman looked uncomfortable but did not intervene. I remember when you turned down that offer from McKinsey. Garrett continued, shaking his head like he was discussing a tragedy. Bet you are regretting that now, huh? Those guys are probably pulling in $300,000 a year by now. I could feel the heat rising in my face. Around us, other conversations had quieted. People were listening, watching, waiting to see how I would respond. Different paths work for different people, I said calmly, but my knuckles were white around my glass. Garrett leaned in, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that everyone could still hear. Listen, if you need a referral, I might be able to help you out. We actually have some entry-level positions opening up at Meridian. Nothing fancy, but it is a start, right? The emphasis on entry-level was deliberate, designed to sting. And it did. Here I was, 32 years old, with an MBA from a top school being offered entry-level work, like I was a recent college graduate who had failed to launch. Brad Garrett's colleague looked at me with what might have been pity. What kind of work are you looking for, Chaim? Before I could answer, Garrett jumped in again. He is between opportunities. That is the nice way to say it, right? He laughed, and a few others joined in nervously. The humiliation was complete. I could see Kyle's face turning red with anger on my behalf, but I shook my head slightly, signaling him to stay quiet. Getting defensive would only make things worse. Revealing the truth would violate my NDA and potentially cost me millions. I appreciate the thought, Garrett, I said, setting down my glass. But I need to make a call. Excuse me. I walked away with as much dignity as I could manage, heading toward the balcony on the far side of the rooftop. Behind me, I could hear Garrett's group resuming their conversation, probably dissecting my failures and feeling superior about their corporate positions. Kyle found me 5 minutes later leaning against the railing and staring out at the Manhattan skyline. That guy is a complete jerk, Kyle said, his voice tight with frustration. You should have seen how smug he looked after you left. I wanted to punch him. Not worth it, I said, though my hands were still shaking slightly. You should see how he treats people at his company, Kyle continued. I have a friend who works there, says Garrett is notorious for being a nightmare boss. Yells at people in meetings, takes credit for other people's work, the whole toxic package. Something in that comment caught my attention. Meridian Capital Partners, I said slowly. They have been in the news lately, right? Yeah, they just got acquired by some big private equity fund. Whole company is going through restructuring. A thought began forming in my mind, but I pushed it aside. I needed to let this go. In 3 months, my NDA would expire and I could share my success publicly. Garrett's opinion would not matter then. But when I got home that night, I could not sleep. The humiliation kept replaying in my mind. Not just the words, but the looks on people's faces. The pity, the judgment, the assumption that I had failed. At 2 a.m, I opened my laptop and started researching Meridian Capital Partners. What I found made me sit up straighter. The private equity fund that had acquired Meridian was managed by the same investment group where I served as a strategic advisor. The same group that had been involved in acquiring my startup. I dug deeper. As an advisor, I had access to internal documents about all of the fund's portfolio companies. Meridian Capital Partners was one of them, and that meant I had access to performance reviews, financial reports, and organizational charts, including information about senior directors, including information about Garrett. I pulled up the files, my heart racing. What I saw made my jaw drop. Garrett's department had the highest turnover rate in the entire company. 43% of his team had left in the past year. There were multiple HR complaints filed against him for creating a hostile work environment. A major project he was leading had gone over budget by 20% with no end in sight. But that was not all. As a strategic advisor, I did not just have access to read these files, I had input on major decisions. The investment group regularly consulted with me on leadership assessments, particularly for senior management at portfolio companies. I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. Garrett had no idea who he had just humiliated. He thought he was punching down at an unemployed nobody. He had actually insulted someone who had significant influence over his career. I did not want revenge. That was not who I was. But I did believe in accountability, and if Garrett was truly the toxic leader that the data suggested, then he should not be in a position of power over other people. I spent the next 2 weeks carefully reviewing everything related to Meridian Capital Partners. I read employee surveys. I examined project outcomes. I looked at client retention rates under different department heads. The picture that emerged was clear. Garrett's division was underperforming. His team was miserable and his leadership style was damaging the company. Then I got an email that changed everything. The quarterly business review for Meridian Capital Partners was scheduled for the following month, and as a strategic advisor, I was invited to attend. The meeting would include all senior leadership, including Garrett. I accepted the invitation immediately, and I did not tell anyone I was coming. The morning of the quarterly business review, I woke up early and spent extra time getting ready. I chose a charcoal gray suit, custom-tailored, paired with a crisp white shirt and a dark blue tie. Italian leather shoes. Simple silver cufflinks. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone very different from the casually dressed man Garrett had mocked at the alumni event. The meeting was held at Meridian Capital's headquarters on the 28th floor of a midtown skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the Hudson River. I arrived exactly on time, signed in at the reception desk, and was escorted to the executive conference room. Garrett was already there when I walked in. He was standing near the coffee station laughing loudly at something one of his colleagues had said. He wore a navy suit with a pocket square that matched his tie exactly. His Rolex caught the morning light. He looked comfortable, confident, completely unaware that his world was about to shift. I walked to the opposite side of the room and helped myself to coffee black with no sugar. A few other executives were scattered around the large conference table reviewing their notes and checking phones. Nobody paid much attention to me yet. Then Douglas, the CEO of Meridian Capital Partners, entered the room. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and an air of no-nonsense authority. "Good morning, everyone," Douglas said, setting his briefcase down